All right, let's dive into some pretty heady stuff today. Theories of consciousness,
That's right.
specifically higher order theories.
Yes.
And we're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on this.
Sounds good.
I have to say, even for someone who, really likes thinking about these sorts of things,
Yeah.
this one's pretty dense.
It is. It is.
But thankfully, we have our expert here who can help us unpack it all.
Happy to help.
So I guess the best way to start this is with the question that's probably kept many a philosopher up at night.
Sure.
How do you know you're not dreaming right now?
Yeah, it's a classic thought experiment.
Right.
It gets right at the heart of what consciousness is and why it's so baffling to us.
Yeah.
We all have this feeling of subjective experience, right?
Right.
We all feel like there's something, it's like to be us, to
Yeah.
be aware of the world, to have thoughts.
Yeah.
But explaining what creates that feeling,
Right.
that is where things get very tricky.
So before we get into the higher order part,
Yeah.
maybe we should just take a step back.
Sure.
And just talk about, like, when philosophers talk about consciousness, what are they even talking about?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, like, my dog's awake right now, so he's conscious.
Okay.
But is he conscious in the same way that we are?
Yeah, so that's the key distinction that philosophers make.
Okay.
There's this basic kind of consciousness,
Yeah.
which is just being awake and responsive to the environment. You know, your dog definitely has that.
Yeah.
But then there's what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness.
Okay.
And this is the subjective feeling of experience.
Okay.
So it's the redness of a sunset,
Yeah.
pang of a heartache,
Right.
a taste of chocolate.
So it's not just that we, like, see a red apple.
Right.
It's that there's a certain feeling associated with seeing that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this feeling, what philosophers call qualia.
Yeah.
This is what makes consciousness such a fascinating and frustrating puzzle.
Yeah.
We know it exists.
Right.
We experience it constantly. But explaining what creates it in the first place,
Yeah.
that's a whole other story.
That's where these higher order theories come in.
That's right.
They're trying to, like, bridge this gap
Okay.
between the physical world
Yeah,
and this subjective realm of feelings
Yeah.
and experience.
that's right. So most of us accept that we have thoughts and desires that we're not consciously aware of.
That's right.
So think about solving a problem in your sleep,
Raw.
or having a sudden insight that seems to come out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
Higher order theories say that the difference between a conscious thought and an unconscious one
Okay.
is awareness.
Okay.
So you become conscious of a thought or a perception when you have a higher order representation of it. And so you have essentially a thought about that mental state.
So if I'm understanding this right,
Okay.
like, for something to be conscious,
Yeah.
it needs this, like, second layer of mental activity.
Yes, the general idea.
This,
yeah.
like, awareness.
Yeah.
That's directed back at the thought or the perception.
It's like having an inner observer in your mind
Mm-hmm.
that's commenting on what's happening.
Okay, but
Yeah.
can you even have unconscious perceptions?
Right.
Like, isn't perceiving something inherently tied to being aware of it?
So that's what we tend to think.
Yeah.
But there's some interesting evidence that suggests otherwise.
Okay.
So think about absent-minded driving.
Okay.
You arrive at your destination safely.
Yeah.
But you realize you barely remember the journey you must have been seeing.
Right.
But were you consciously aware of every stop sign, every turn?
Yeah, okay, I've definitely had that experience.
Right.
Like, you're just on autopilot or something.
Exactly.
But then how do you explain
Uh,
cases like blind sight, where people with damage to certain brain areas can react to visual stimuli they claim not to see?
So that's one of the things that makes this so intriguing, right?
Yeah.
It seems to suggest that there are these levels of processing that happen below the level of conscious awareness. So these individuals, they're processing visual information. They're acting on it,
Right.
but without consciously seeing it.
So then what makes regular vision conscious?
Right.
Is it just that we have this additional layer of awareness, this higher order component
Yes. Yeah.
that's somehow missing in these other cases?
That's what these theories are trying to figure out, right?
Right.
There's something about consciously seeing the world
Yeah.
that's different from simply processing visual information.
Mm-hmm.
And that difference, according to higher order theories,
Yeah.
is the presence of these higher order representations.
Right.
These are what illuminate our experiences,
Okay.
bring them into the spotlight of conscious awareness.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Okay, so, we've been talking about these higher order theories,
yeah.
and they're not without their critics.
Okay.
And in fact, exploring the criticisms
yeah.
can help us understand some of the nuances of these theories even better.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those criticisms.
Okay.
We briefly touched on this idea of an inner sense
Right.
that kind of like observes our mental states.
Yeah.
Um, and it's kind of a captivating idea, right?
Yeah.
This notion of like an inner eye
Right.
that's perceiving our own thoughts and feelings.
Mhm.
Um, but I imagine there are some problems with this idea.
Yeah, there are definitely some challenges for inner sense theories.
Okay.
One of the biggest is that we don't seem to have any distinct feeling
Oh,
associated with this inner sense.
okay.
So we experience the redness of red,
Yeah.
the taste of chocolate,
Mm-hmm.
but do we ever experience the feeling of our inner sense perceiving those things?
Yeah. That's a good point. If it's a sense,
Oh, yeah.
like any other, shouldn't it have its own unique feel, its own
Exactly.
qualia?
Critics argue that the absence of this higher order phenomenology
Okay.
suggests that maybe there isn't a separate inner sense after all.
So it's like we don't need another eye to see what our first eye is seeing.
Right. Exactly.
Um, and wouldn't a system like that be prone to malfunctions?
That's another good point.
Yeah.
What if your inner sense misfires
Right.
and you see red, but it feels like it seems blue?
Yeah.
Right.
Our conscious experience feels pretty seamless.
It does.
We don't seem to have experiences where like the content of our perception
Right.
and then our awareness of that perception
Yeah.
are somehow mismatched.
Yeah.
So
That leads some to question
Yeah.
whether inner sense theory can really account for that.
it seems like a lot of mental machinery
It does.
just to be aware of a simple perception.
Right.
So
Yeah.
what about the other camp,
Okay.
the higher order thought theories or HOT theories?
Right.
Do they do any better?
Well, they have their own set of hurdles to clear.
Okay.
One of the main criticisms leveled at actualist HOT theory
Okay.
is that it seems to require this massive number of thoughts to be constantly firing
Right.
in order for us to be aware of even the simplest things.
So like if I'm looking at a busy city street
Right.
with all the sights and sounds,
Yeah.
is my brain really generating a separate thought for each and every little detail that I'm aware of?
Right. It seems incredibly inefficient.
Yeah.
And, our brains are remarkably efficient machines,
Right.
honed by evolution to conserve energy.
Yeah.
So critics argue that actualist HOT theory just requires too much mental overhead.
Okay.
And some proponents of the theory have tried to address this by suggesting that maybe consciousness is more fragmented than we think.
Okay.
So maybe only a small subset of our perceptions are actually conscious at any given time.
So like a spotlight of awareness
Yeah.
that shines on certain experiences
Exactly.
while others remain in dark.
That's the idea.
Okay.
But even with this spotlight model,
Yeah.
actualist HOT theory still faces the challenge of explaining how a thought, even a conscious thought, can give rise to the feeling of subjective experience.
Right. It's like just because I think I see red,
Yeah.
that thought itself doesn't necessarily imbue the color red with its own special feeling.
It's a tricky issue,
Yeah.
and one that both actualist and dispositionalist HOT theories have to grapple with.
Right. Because dispositionalist HOT just says that it's enough for the thought to be available,
Right.
even if it's not actively occurring.
Exactly.
But then how do you account for
Right.
the vividness and the immediacy
That's right.
of our experience?
It's a challenge.
Okay, so both versions of HOT theory have their critics.
They do.
Are there any other big picture concerns that apply to like all higher order theories?
Yeah, one major issue is the problem of animal consciousness.
Okay.
If consciousness depends on these higher order thoughts,
Right.
which seem to require a certain level of cognitive sophistication,
Yeah.
where does that leave animals?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Right.
Because it seems like a lot of animals experience the world in a way that like feels like something.
It does.
You know, they react to pain, they show emotions,
Yeah.
they even engage in problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to imagine all of that happening without any accompanying feeling.
It is, and that's a real sticking point for higher order theories.
Yeah.
If we're going to say that consciousness requires these complex cognitive abilities,
Right.
then we might have to conclude that many animals aren't conscious,
Right.
which goes against a lot of people's intuitions.
And it has ethical implications too.
It does.
Like how we treat animals.
Right.
How we think about their place in the world.
Absolutely.
All of that changes
Yeah.
if we acknowledge that they have conscious experiences.
This question of animal consciousness is a reminder that these philosophical discussions
Right.
aren't just abstract thought experiments.
Yeah.
They have real-world consequences.
So even with all these criticisms,
Yeah.
are there any compelling arguments in favor of higher order theories?
There are?
Like, why have they remained so influential in philosophy of mind?
Well, one of the most appealing aspects of higher order theories
Yeah.
is that they offer a very clear and intuitive way to distinguish
Yeah.
between conscious and unconscious mental states. So they provide a framework for understanding how we can be aware of our own thoughts and perceptions,
Mm-hmm.
which is something that other theories of consciousness often struggle to explain.
So they provide this mechanism for that inner observer,
Precisely.
that sense of ourselves as the subject
Yes.
of our experiences.
Exactly.
Right.
And they also fit well with our understanding of how the brain works.
Okay.
We know that the brain is this complex, multi-layered system
Right.
with different areas responsible for different functions.
Yeah.
Higher order theories suggest that consciousness arises from the interaction between these different areas,
Oh, okay.
with higher level areas monitoring and reflecting
Right.
upon the activity of lower level areas.
It's almost like the brain is having a conversation with itself.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
And this idea of the brain as a self-monitoring system
Mm-hmm.
aligns well with neuroscientific findings, which have shown that certain brain regions,
Yeah.
particularly in the prefrontal cortex,
Right.
seem to be involved in self-awareness
Yeah.
and metacognition.
Okay, so while higher order theories have their challenges,
Yes,
they also offer a compelling explanation
they do.
for how our brains might generate this sense of subjective experience.
That's right. And they continue to be a major focus of research and debate
Yeah.
in the field of consciousness studies.
Okay, so we've explored the ins and outs of HOP and HOT theories,
We have,
their strengths and weaknesses.
right?
We've tackled tricky questions about inner senses and unconscious perceptions,
Yes.
and this thorny issue of animal consciousness.
It's been quite a journey.
Yeah.
And as with any good deep dive,
Mhm.
we've probably surfaced more questions than answers.
That's the beauty of philosophy.
Yes,
It keeps us questioning, keeps us searching.
exactly. Yeah.
But before we wrap things up, I want to touch on one more thing that we briefly mentioned earlier.
Okay.
Those self-representational theories.
Right.
Can you give us a quick rundown of what those are all about?
Yeah.
All right, so we're back and ready to wrap up this deep dive into higher order theories. We've covered a lot of ground,
We have
from inner senses to animal consciousness.
lots to think about.
Yeah. But before we resurface, I want to circle back to these self-representational theories you mentioned.
Okay.
They sound even more mind-bending than the ones we've already discussed.
They do a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So self-representational theories are trying to address some of these challenges we've been
Yeah.
talking about
Yeah.
by kind of blurring the line between that first order experience and the higher order representation.
Right.
So they say that conscious experiences are, in a way,
Okay.
representations of themselves.
So instead of having a separate thought about the experience,
Right.
the experience itself somehow contains its own awareness.
That's the basic idea.
Okay.
So it's like saying that the experience of seeing a red apple
Yeah.
isn't just this passive reception of visual information. It also includes, in some fundamental way,
Yeah.
an awareness of that very experience.
So it's not a two-step process where
Right.
first you have the experience and then you become aware of it.
Exactly.
It's more like a single integrated thing.
The awareness is built into the experience itself.
Okay. I can see how that might be more elegant.
It is, in a way. Yeah.
But how do these theories actually work?
Right.
How can an experience represent itself?
So there are various ways that these theories try to achieve this.
Okay.
Some of them draw on ideas from neuroscience,
Okay.
suggesting that certain brain regions
Yeah.
might be capable of forming representations
Hmm.
that are both about the world and about themselves.
Okay.
Others appeal to more abstract philosophical concepts, like
Right.
this idea that consciousness is inherently reflexive, always turning back on itself.
I'm starting to see why this is considered a deep dive.
Yeah.
It feels like we're going down a rabbit hole
We are.
of increasingly complex ideas.
But it's a fascinating rabbit hole,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
the deeper we go,
Yeah.
the more we realize just how mysterious consciousness really is.
So even with all of these different theories,
Yeah.
we still haven't fully cracked the code
Not quite.
of what creates this subjective experience.
But these theories and the debates that they spark,
Mm-hmm.
they help us refine our understanding.
Yeah.
They push us to ask better questions.
Right.
And ultimately, they bring us closer
Okay.
to unraveling this profound mystery,
Well, I have to say, my mind is definitely feeling stretched after all that.
as it should be.
But it's a good stretch.
It is.
The kind that makes you realize how much more there is to discover.
That's the spirit.
Yeah.
And speaking of discovering,
Yeah.
I think this is a good point to kind of shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and explore some of the broader implications of what we've been talking about.
Okay, let's do it.
All right.
So we've talked a lot about the theoretical side of things. But how do these ideas about consciousness actually play out in the real world?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
So for one thing,
Yeah.
these theories challenge some of our basic assumptions about how we understand ourselves
Okay.
and our relationship to the world.
Okay.
So we tend to think of our conscious minds
Yeah.
as being in control, right?
Well,
Like we're the drivers of our actions and decisions.
We're the captain of our own mental ship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But higher order theories, especially those that emphasize these unconscious processes,
Right.
suggest that the captain might not have as much control as they think.
Okay.
There might be a whole crew working below deck,
Right.
influencing our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors without us even realizing it.
So it's less about being in control.
It might be.
Yeah. And more about understanding the interplay
Right.
between these conscious and unconscious processes.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And that realization can be both liberating and a little unsettling.
Yeah, I can see that.
Right.
Yeah.
It frees us from this illusion
Okay.
that we're always fully rational
Yeah.
and in charge.
Yeah.
But it also raises all sorts of questions about the nature of free will
Right.
and moral responsibility.
If we're not always aware of the forces that are shaping our actions,
Right.
can we truly be held accountable for them?
Big questions.
Yeah, those are big questions.
Yeah. And speaking of big questions,
Yeah.
we've touched on the problem of animal consciousness a few times.
Yeah.
How do these theories inform our understanding of whether animals have conscious experiences?
That's one of the most hotly debated areas
It is.
where these theories have real-world implications.
Right.
So if consciousness depends on higher-order representations, we need to figure out if animals
Right.
have the capacity
Exactly.
for those representations.
It seems like many animals, especially mammals and birds,
Yeah.
they exhibit behaviors that suggest at least some level of conscious awareness.
Yeah. They react to pain.
They do.
They form social bonds. They even seem to solve problems
Right.
in creative ways.
And those observations fuel the debate, right?
Yeah.
Some argue that we shouldn't ascribe consciousness to animals unless we have very clear evidence
Right.
of the kinds of complex cognitive abilities that higher order theories suggest are necessary.
Okay.
Others say that we should give animals the benefit of the doubt.
Right.
Their behavior is complex enough
Yeah.
that we should assume that they're conscious, even if we don't fully understand the mechanisms behind it.
So it's a question that touches on ethics and biology,
It does.
philosophy, and, even our own understanding of what it means to be human.
Exactly.
And as if things weren't complex enough already.
I know, right?
We've got artificial intelligence rapidly evolving.
That's right.
So do higher order theories have anything to say about whether AI could ever be truly conscious?
Yeah, that's another fascinating frontier. Okay.
Where these theories come into play.
Yeah.
So if consciousness arises from higher order representations, then it stands to reason that any system,
Okay.
whether it's biological or artificial,
Right.
that can form these kinds of representations
Yeah.
might have the potential for consciousness.
So as AI systems become more and more sophisticated,
Right.
might they develop the ability to have thoughts about their own thoughts,
Potentially.
to reflect on their own experiences?
It's a possibility
Yeah.
that we need to take seriously.
Right.
And if that were to happen,
Yeah.
it would raise these profound questions
Okay.
about our relationship with these intelligent machines.
Right. Like, do we have moral obligations to them?
Exactly.
Would we consider them to be persons in their own right?
These are the questions that we need to start thinking about now.
Yeah. It's exciting and a little daunting at the same time
It is.
to imagine a future
Right.
where we might be sharing the world with conscious AI. It is. But it's a future that we need to be prepared for. And understanding the philosophical underpinnings of consciousness, like we've been doing today,
Right.
is a crucial step in that preparation.
Well, I think it's safe to say that this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
From the intricate workings of our own minds to these broader implications for animal welfare
Yeah,
and the future of AI.
for sure.
It's clear that the question of consciousness
Absolutely.
is one that will continue to captivate and challenge us
Yes,
for years to come.
for sure.
So thank you so much for guiding us through this incredibly thought-provoking exploration.
It's been my pleasure.
I know I'll be pondering these ideas
I hope so.
long after we sign off.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Remember, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop being curious about the mysteries of your own mind and the world around you.